Hi there people, how you doing? So, it's time to compare the biggest rivals in the smartphone industry thus far. The S22 Ultra versus the iPhone 14 Pro. Now of course, you may have already seen some camera comparisons, but I would say that comparisons like this, well, they just never get really old, at least in my books. But regardless, I do think that the photography side of things is going to be far more interesting than the videos. We already can expect, what we might get from video, especially for these two, but photography is where things can get a little bit surprising. So let's jump right in. Alright, we are starting off with a very simple daylight shot. As you can see, a very obvious difference. The S22 Ultra, super vibrant. And yes, I'm using the scene optimizer over here, and I'll show you the difference. There's not much, but we'll get there. But the iPhone, on the other hand, way less saturation. Now, it is not 100% accurate in terms of colors and white balance all the time, but at least, comparatively, the iPhone does look more accurate in this scene at least. Now, here's another one, and well, I just kept this one because I just want to show you guys the sky. It's a little insane on the S22 Ultra, wouldn't you agree? Like that goes a little overboard with that vibrance and saturation there. It looks a bit too fake. Moving on, here's an ultra wide shot, and as you can see, it's a very similar story. A bunch of saturation happening on the S22 Ultra. And I don't mind it, but I'm not the biggest fan either. Moving on to the main camera shot, and the one major difference that you're gonna see quite a bit is that the iPhone is the one which has a lot of contrast. As you can see, it is crushing shadows there, while the S22 is trying to preserve the details and all that jazz, and we'll see a lot of that happening. Moving on, however, we have 2x zoom, and no, this is not optical on either phone, but having said that, the iPhone does have a sensor crop built into the camera, and it works extremely well. Let me tell you right now, it was quite surprising just how much detail it preserved. At 3x zoom, however, both are optical here, and yes, the iPhone does have more detail. It has a higher quality 3x zoom camera, so you do get better detail, at least when taking 3x zoom shots. But having said that, you can also notice that the iPhone punches in a little bit more. Even though both are saying 3x, the focal length isn't exactly the same. But then I just thought, why not try out a 6x zoom? It's an intermediate between the 3x optical and 10x optical on the S22 Ultra, and I had expected that the iPhone would perform better given that it gave us more detail in 3x zoom, but that's not the case. I mean, I'm not sure how much you can see after you do compression, but the noise and detail levels is much better on the S22 Ultra. I'm not entirely sure what changed when we zoomed in further, but yeah, the S22 is actually looking better in this case. At 10x, and well, let's be honest, anything beyond 10x, you're going to get better results on the S22 Ultra. Now the difference isn't, night and day, but it is a fairly significant difference, which makes me immediately and obviously prefer the S22 Ultra here. 30x zoom on the S22, you can see just the sheer amount of detail that you can preserve, and these aren't even, perfect, ideal conditions, but even now, it is doing a fantastic job. 15 times is the maximum you can do on the iPhone 14 Pro there. But for the very first time in the history of all iPhones, we have high resolution, proper high resolution. It's 48 megapixels on the iPhone 14 Pro. Now yes, it's way lower than what we have on the S22 Ultra there, 108 megapixels versus 48. You might expect a lot more detail on the S22 Ultra. I mean, I did too, but turns out the S22 Ultra is the one that's falling behind in terms of high-res detail preservation. That's a lot of detail we're getting on the iPhone there, and way less than I would have possibly expected on the S22 Ultra. And over here, it's a simple one. Yes, there are some differences in white balance and all that. The S22 is not quite as accurate compared to the iPhone, which is not usually the case. I mean, both have their issues, but we'll talk about that later. Now we are going to zoom in once again to 5 times, and yes, this is ironclad proof. The iPhone 14 Pro has better detail preservation with its 48 megapixel sensor compared to the 108 one on the S22 Ultra. I mean, wow. Now, as I said, the S22 Ultra is almost always going to give you very saturated images. Now, you may not like that, so a lot of people did recommend turning off scene optimizer and all that. I did just that here. Scene optimizer is turned off. I would say the saturation went down like a hair. That's me being generous because I can hardly see the difference. This right here is with Scene Optimizer turned on, and especially when you have the iPhone, which has way lower vibrance in its image, the difference is extremely hard to spot. There is a little bit of difference, but not nearly enough. But having said that, dynamic range. Something that I consider to be very important when it comes to flagship cameras in general. I can tell you I've taken my fair share of these, and I know for a fact that a lot of people love to take shots like these. It turns out looking very nice, like on the S22 Ultra. And that is not going to be the case on the iPhone 14 Pro. You can see there we have a white balance problem. It's completely removing all of that beautiful warmth that we're supposed to have during sunsets, and of course no highlight preservation. Moving on, this shot I had completely expected the iPhone to have improved over the previous one. But I don't know, man. I can tell you right now, the iPhone has a problem with HDR, a very major problem. Like, this is supposed to be an easy shot for the iPhone. Now, in a case like this, I can tell you that if I had turned off the Scene Optimizer, maybe I would have just hit the right spot with the saturation. This is definitely looking oversaturated on the S22. But having said that, am I going to pick the iPhone over the S22 Ultra? I don't think so, not a chance. It doesn't even look like there's a sunset happening in the background. Look at how beautiful the warmth looks, and you can see the detail in the clouds. It is a beautiful shot on the S22 Ultra and not even close on the iPhone. Now we're moving on to close-up shots with the main camera. Now initially I had thought that the iPhone would have a lot of potential because we can firstly turn off the automatic switch to macro, and we have a much larger, much higher quality main camera sensor. So I thought, we can get some beautiful main camera close-ups, like on the S22 Ultra right here. But we cannot get close with it. It cannot focus any closer. At least in this case, it could not focus any closer than that. You cannot really use it for close-ups. You cannot take advantage of that amazing creamy bokeh that you can get, the depth of field, all that jazz. It is just such a lost opportunity. Now here's another shot with indoors lighting and kind of a close-up. I didn't try to get super close with the S22 Ultra here, which is why, they're not too far off. Having said that, the lighting situation is very tricky. We have warm light on the subject and a pretty bright white light in the background. So the balance is better on the iPhone. You get proper warmth instead of that reddish hue that we are getting on the subject. It doesn't really look very nice on the S22 Ultra. That much I can tell you right now. Now here's another shot in almost exactly same kind of lighting. We have white daylight outside and very warm light falling on the subject. Now there are a few things here. Firstly, take a look at the general clarity and contrast happening in especially like the midtones of the iPhone. You can see so much more detail is just popping out. Having said that, take a look at the colors. The warmth on the S22 Ultra is perfectly balanced this time around. The iPhone is going a little overboard with it, but it is nailing the background. It has perfect white in the background. The daylight is properly maintained, while the S22 is making it look blue for some very odd reason. So yeah, bunch of differences here. Now moving on, we have macro. And yes, we can get closer to the subject with the iPhone's macro mode. That much is very clear, but the S22 is handling the warmth very, very well. It's basically perfect. Here's another macro, and yes, the white balance is completely off on both phones. One is way too warm on the iPhone, and it's way too cool on the S22 Ultra. So yeah, both of their issues here. Having said that, the iPhone can get closer, and it just has so much more sharpening and the mid-tone contrast or clarity, whatever have you. It really helps out with bringing out details in this case. This was in broad daylight, so you can see that we have very low noise levels. But in medium lighting or low light conditions, you're gonna have far more noise on the iPhone, so that's kind of going to be a disadvantage, in some cases at least. Moving on to human subjects, this is where things get really interesting. For this selfie, I would still say the S22 Ultra is taking a lead, because once again I took this shot in warm sunlight. And yes, the iPhone has a tremendous tendency to desaturate things. Like, I noticed the exact same tendency when I compared the iPhone to the X80 Pro as well. You can check them out using the link in the description. But in this case at least, I do think that the S22 is more accurate with the warmth. Now here's another selfie in slightly trickier lighting, and we still get a little bit of desaturation happening on the iPhone. It's not as bad as the previous shot at least. But on the S22 this time around, we get a little bit more magenta happening. I mean, this time it's not doing so terribly, but there are going to be instances where the magenta is going to be a problem. Moving on to a backlit shot, and I would say the iPhone is actually doing pretty well here. I mean, I had completely expected the iPhone to either completely crush my shadows or just do something crazier with the highlights, but it's handling it quite well, like surprisingly so. And yes, absolutely, this time I think the magenta is going a little overboard on my skin. I'm looking a little bit more red than I would personally prefer. So I do like the iPhone in general for this shot at least. Now for selfie portraits, well, in this case, once again you can see the magenta coming into my t-shirt there. I'm not sure why the S22 does that, but trust me when I say there are multiple instances the S22 has done this over the course of the year. We used it and we will see more samples of that soon enough. But having said that, when in direct sunlight, you can see that the S22 is doing a really good job with maintaining the warmth. And also, one more thing I really wanted to point out is that although the iPhone's selfie camera can go wider in normal photo mode, if you want to take portraits, you have to crop in. I don't really like cropped in selfies like on the iPhone. I prefer the wider field of view on the S22 Ultra, personally at least. Now moving on to a backlit selfie portrait, and as you can see, the lens flaring on the iPhone, it was a bit too much. Like, I tried out different angles as well, and the lens flaring was pretty constant, but we also have a good bit of magenta making it into the photo. I mean, you can very clearly see the difference between the grey on the iPhone, which is very accurate, compared to the S22, which has that magenta. Now moving on to night mode selfies. We do have the best night mode selfie on the S22 Ultra. I've said that before, and I'll say it as many times as I have to. The iPhone, I'm not exactly sure what it's trying to do here, because up until now, every single selfie we had desaturated skin tones and it didn't handle the warmth properly. Now all of a sudden it decides to make me red. I mean, what else can I say? It's just weird on the iPhone. It just works in mysterious ways sometimes, I guess. But that's not the only problem with the iPhone selfie. It has far too much noise and far less detail compared to the S22 Ultra. There is a little issue on the S22 Ultra as well. I'm pretty sure you can see it. The background, which is supposed to have a white light coming in, it has become blue. But of course, we also get night mode portrait selfies on the S22 Ultra. We don't have that feature on the iPhone, and needless to say, the S22 does a massively better job. I'm actually surprised that the iPhone managed to take a portrait shot. And well, obviously the iPhone kind of looks like I've either seen or have become a ghost. So yeah, the S22 takes a pretty simple win here. Moving on to regular rear camera portraits, and this is with the 1x camera. I can tell you right now, this shot was challenging. I mean, not in terms of HDR, that stuff is fine. It's the warmth in the scene. There was a lot of warm light falling on me, and that was quite intentional. I mean, you can see that the iPhone can handle the situation way better than the S22 Ultra. The crazy amount of saturation we're getting on the skin, I'm not a fan of that. Now here's a 3x zoomed in shot in similar lighting conditions. I would say both phones are doing a really good job here in terms of handling that warmth. And yes, we do have some white daylight coming in from the back. And what surprises me really is that the iPhone's 3x zoom shot, it doesn't look very nice. There's not a lot of detail happening here, and this kept happening, by the way. There are multiple shots that we took in the same situation and it was the same here. So yeah, the S22 takes a pretty significant win here. Now moving on to a very backlit shot, and as you can see, the iPhone is doing a better job. It's simply because of the magenta situation we have going on the S22 Ultra. As I said, if you have a predominantly warm scene, which was the case over here, you get a lot of magenta. I mean, yes, it may not happen 100% of the time, but in my experience, it happens a lot. Here's another 2x zoom portrait, and I mean the difference is plenty obvious here. We do still have that issue with the magenta. You can see it on my shirt. It's not affecting the skin all that badly, so that's something nice. It's not as drastic of a problem as we had in some of the previous shots, but what I do like about the S22 is that it is lifting the shadows a little bit and it's giving us a lot of detail in my face. So even though I'm not a huge fan of the magenta, I do like the S22 in this case. And now what about night mode portraits? Now both are pretty good at this, especially when you're using 1x zoom. You can get some really nice and very detailed results, as you can see. And as for white balance, both have their own set of issues right there. The iPhone overcompensates and makes it look like there was no warmth at all, even though there was quite a bit. While on the S22 Ultra, we get a fair bit of red happening as well. You can see it especially on the road at 2x zoom. However, yeah, the iPhone is doing a far better job. I mean, yes, it is really dark. Like, I can barely even make out some of the details on my face, but at least it's not turning out to be like the S22. And yeah, don't use 3x on the iPhone 14 Pro. Stick to 2x, you're gonna have a billion times better result. Like, wow. On the S22, this time surprisingly with 3x zoom, it actually gave us a very decent looking image. I mean, this is usable compared to the trash that we had in the previous shot, and also whatever we are having on the iPhone here. Now moving on to night mode. Well, in this case, as you can see, it's a simple shot, and well, the iPhone is doing a very good job with the white balance, I'll give it that. You know, the little bit of warmth coming in from the street lights, it is handling that really well. It is maintaining it while also not going overboard with it. The S22 is going overboard. You can see the magenta, it just fills up the building. You can see the magenta happening in the sky as well, which is not very nice to look at. Now this one is a little bit more challenging. You know, there's a lot of highlights to control and of course shadows to expose. Clearly the iPhone is handling the highlights pretty well, but the shadows are more crushed compared to the S22 Ultra. Having said that, we once again have a very similar problem with white balance on both phones. The S22 just goes crazy with it, while the iPhone, it overcompensates and it just looks like the streetlight was white, even though it was yellow or warm. Moving on to 2x with night mode, and in this case I really like the way the iPhone looks. It is compensating a little more for the warmth, but I mean, of course it is moving ahead with detail preservation. It is far better with details compared to the S22 Ultra. That sensor crop, it works, and it works even at night, so that's very impressive right there. Now moving on to an ultra wide shot. In this case, the iPhone is the one that's kind of screwing things up. You can see that it has almost no detail, especially in the upper, much more darker parts of the image, and even the general detail preservation is very low on the iPhone. Also, surprisingly, the S22 Ultra is doing a fantastic job with white balance this time around. We don't have that terrible magenta that we had in the previous shot. Now moving on to 3x zoom. Now in this case, it's very clear that the iPhone is using its 3x telephoto. Clearly, it is doing a far better job than the S22, which is cropping in from the main camera, and it just has close to no detail whatsoever. Now moving on to 10x zoom, and yes, both look pretty terrible here, being completely honest. I just think that I ended up taking a situation that was a bit too dark, even for the S22's 10x optical. But of course, at severely low light conditions like these, even if you crank it, it makes no difference on the iPhone. It's just going to give you a terribly dim result. That's the biggest complaint here. The S22 on the other hand, it's very good. It is handling the warmth perfectly, it's handling the dynamic range perfectly. I mean, it's surprisingly good. Now in similar conditions, I took an ultra wide shot, and trust me, the shadows were way darker than what it appears to be, especially in case of the S22. It is doing a tremendous job with the detail preservation. But the iPhone, it has crushed shadows, it doesn't have a ton of details, it has, however, a ton of noise, which obviously doesn't look very nice now, does it? So yeah, not a fan of how the ultra low light, ultra wide turned out on the iPhone. The S22 is definitely the winner here. So that right there is the end of our camera comparison, at least photography comparison for the S22 and the iPhone 14 Pro. I must say both have their predominant issues. Especially with white balance, I mean, both of them suffer quite a bit. Like yeah, the S22, I mean, the magenta is the biggest issue in my opinion. If that can be fixed, then a lot of problems on the S22 could just, you know, become obsolete. The iPhone on the other hand, its biggest problem is the HDR. Unless Apple fixes it, I just cannot recommend the iPhone in good faith. It just doesn't cut it, at least not for me. Now your opinions may differ, maybe you just don't like taking backlit shots. That's going to depend on you. But with all of that said, I do hope you guys enjoyed this comparison. Hope you found it helpful. And well, I'll be seeing you guys soon enough with a video comparison for the iPhone 14 Pro. Cheers!